Most people believe the difference between staying broke forever and building real wealth is enormous. They imagine it requires a massive salary, insider connections, or extraordinary luck. But the truth is far simpler and far more uncomfortable. The gap between struggling financially and beginning the journey toward real wealth is often just about $15,000. That number sounds small compared to what we usually associate with wealth, and that's exactly why almost nobody talks about it. In fact, many people in the financial industry would prefer that you never understand this idea, because the reality is almost embarrassingly simple. Wealth is not mysterious, it's not magic, it's arithmetic. And once you understand the arithmetic, you begin to see that everything changes after you cross a certain threshold. My name is Ray Dalio. I founded Bridgewater Associates, which eventually became the largest hedge fund in the world, managing more than $120 billion. Over the past 5 decades, I've advised central banks, governments, and some of the wealthiest families on the planet. I studied economic cycles, navigated the dot-com crash, and predicted the financial crisis of 2008 before it happened. But despite everything people say about success, there's a part of my story that rarely gets mentioned. In 1982, I lost almost everything. At the time, I was convinced that the global economy was heading straight into a depression. I wasn't guessing. I believed. I had carefully analyzed the data. I presented my predictions publicly and spoke with absolute confidence. I thought I was the smartest person in the room. But the economy didn't collapse. It did the exact opposite. Markets surged, growth accelerated, and my prediction turned out to be completely wrong. My reputation collapsed overnight. Clients left. My business fell apart. I was forced to borrow $4,000 from my father just to pay my bills. That moment forced me to confront a question that would change my life. What truly separates people who eventually build lasting wealth from those who remain broke for their entire lives? It clearly wasn't intelligence, because I considered myself intelligent and still failed spectacularly. It wasn't connections, because plenty of well-connected people also lose everything. And it certainly wasn't luck alone. So I spent the next several years studying this question obsessively. For 5 years, I analyzed thousands of attempts at building wealth. I talked to investors, entrepreneurs, and individuals who had successfully built financial security over time. I also studied people who never escaped financial struggle. Eventually, a pattern began to appear, and it showed up again and again. The difference between the winners and the losers had nothing to do with how clever they were. It had nothing to do with their starting salary. It came down to one simple threshold and what happened after they crossed it. That threshold was $15,000. Now, if you're working a regular job, earning a modest paycheck, and wondering whether financial independence is even possible for someone like you, then this is the moment to pay attention. I understand what it feels like to start with almost nothing. I know what it's like to count every dollar, to worry about paying the bills, and to look at the mountain ahead and wonder if the climb is even possible. One of the biggest mistakes people make about money is misunderstanding how wealth actually grows. In the early stages, progress feels painfully slow. You save a few $100s and it just sits there. You add more over time, but the total barely seems to move. Meanwhile, the people around you appear to be enjoying life. They're buying new cars, taking vacations, upgrading their homes, and spending freely. And if you're the one choosing to save instead of spend, it can start to feel like you're missing out. This is the point where most people quit. They look at their small savings account and decide the effort isn't worth it. The progress feels too slow, the sacrifices feel too large, and the rewards seem invisible. What they don't realize is that they're standing at the base of something incredibly powerful, an exponential curve. At the beginning of that curve, growth appears almost flat. It looks like nothing is happening. But the curve isn't actually flat, it's building momentum. And the people who quit during this stage never experience what happens when that momentum finally begins to accelerate. Understanding a little basic math can completely change how you see this process. Compound interest is one of the most powerful forces in finance, yet most people underestimate its impact. Imagine you manage to save $400 every month. Over a year, that adds up to about $4,800. At the end of the first year, including a small investment return, you might have roughly $5,000. Think about that for a moment. You spend an entire year making sacrifices, bringing lunch from home, skipping vacations, driving an older car, and the result is $5,000. That's when many people lose patience. They look at the number and start doing the math incorrectly. If it takes a year to save $5,000, they assume it will take 20 years to save $100,000. And by that time, they tell themselves, life will have passed them by. But that conclusion is based on linear thinking, and wealth doesn't grow linearly. It grows exponentially. This misunderstanding traps more people in financial struggle than any unfair boss, broken system, or bad luck. The reason $15,000 matters isn't because it's a magical number. It matters because of what begins to happen, both psychologically and mathematically, once you reach it. Psychologically, crossing that threshold changes your identity. Instead of feeling like someone who can't save money, you now have proof that you can. You begin to feel a small sense of security. Suddenly, you're no longer one unexpected car repair away from financial disaster. You have breathing room. Mathematically, something else begins to happen. Your money starts working in a way that you can actually see. Even a modest return on $15,000 begins producing noticeable results. For the first time, your savings start contributing to your progress alongside your own effort. And this is where the entire process begins to shift. But most people never reach this point because they give up during the stage when their money is doing almost nothing and they are doing all the work. The part that people underestimate the most is how dramatically the math begins to shift once you reach that first meaningful threshold. In the beginning, almost all the progress comes from your own effort. You work, you earn, and you save. Your money contributes very little because the amount is still small. But once your savings reach around $15,000, the balance between your effort and your money's effort slowly begins to change. Let's look at this with simple numbers. When you only have $1,000 saved, even a 10% return produces just $100 in a year. That amount is so small that it barely matters. It doesn't change your life and it doesn't feel meaningful. Most people look at that result and assume investing doesn't make much difference. But the equation starts to look very different when the base number grows. When you have $15,000 invested, that same 10% return produces $1,500 in a year. Suddenly your money is producing something you can actually notice. $1,500 is not life-changing yet, but it is visible progress. Now imagine the process continuing. At $30,000 saved, a 10% return produces $3,000 in a year. At that point, your money is contributing almost as much as you contributed through your own savings during the year. Your effort and your capital are now working together. As the numbers grow, the shift becomes even more dramatic. With $75,000 invested, the same return produces $7,500 in a year. Your money is now working almost as hard as you are. And when savings reach $150,000, that same return produces $15,000 in a year. At that point, your money alone is generating the same amount that once represented the entire threshold that changed everything. This is the real secret behind wealth building. In the early stages, your sacrifice carries almost the entire burden. You are the one doing all the work while your money appears to be sitting quietly in the background. But eventually a crossover point arrives. At that moment, your capital begins carrying more of the load. Your money starts contributing more and more, and the process begins to accelerate. The tragedy is that most people never reach this crossover point. They quit during the most difficult stage when they are doing all the work and their money is doing almost nothing. They look at the slow progress and convince themselves that the system doesn't work. They assume the math must be wrong because the early results are so unimpressive. But the mathematics is not wrong. The curve simply hasn't steepened yet. The beginning of an exponential curve always looks flat, and nobody ever reaches the steep part without surviving the flat part first. Along the way, certain mental mistakes trap people in financial struggle. Understanding these mistakes is extremely valuable because avoiding them often matters more than making brilliant financial decisions. The first mistake is impatience. Building wealth requires an extraordinary ability to delay gratification. If you don't naturally have that ability, you must deliberately train yourself to develop it. Unfortunately, most people struggle with this more than they realize. Human beings are constantly surrounded by pressure to spend. Your neighbors upgrade their cars. Your friends post vacation photos on social media. Advertisements appear everywhere, encouraging you to buy things that promise comfort, status, or excitement. After seeing this long enough, something inside the human brain begins interpreting these signals as evidence that you are falling behind. Your savings plan begins to feel pointless. Your sacrifices start to look foolish. You begin wondering if you should simply enjoy life now rather than waiting for some distant financial future. This moment of temptation is where many wealth-building journeys quietly collapse. People spend their seed corn to feel better today. The result is temporary pleasure followed by permanent financial struggle. The arithmetic of impatience is brutal. The person who could have been financially secure at 50 often ends up broke at 50 simply because they couldn't tolerate appearing less successful than their peers at 30. History offers countless examples of this pattern. One of the most famous involves Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart was one of the greatest composers who ever lived. His music would endure for centuries and bring joy to millions of people. Yet despite his extraordinary talent and the substantial income he earned during his career, Mozart died broke. The reason was simple. He consistently spent more money than he earned. No matter how much income arrived, his spending rose even faster. His genius in music could not compensate for his lack of discipline with money. If someone with Mozart's level of talent and success could not escape this trap, it should serve as a powerful warning. Income alone does not create wealth. High earners go broke all the time because they simply expand their lifestyle to match their income. A person earning $40,000 per year who consistently saves $5,000 annually will eventually build far more wealth than someone earning $200,000 who saves nothing. Arithmetic does not care about job titles, prestige, or tax brackets. Wealth is determined by the gap between what you earn and what you keep. The second mistake that destroys wealth-building attempts is envy. Many people assume the world is driven primarily by greed. In reality, envy plays an even larger role. I have seen more financial plans destroyed by envy than by market crashes. You may have a solid plan, you're saving consistently, your progress toward $15,000 is steady. Then one day you notice someone else getting richer faster than you. Suddenly your progress feels insignificant. That is when people begin abandoning sensible strategies. They take unnecessary risks trying to catch up. They spend money to prove they are not falling behind. They compare their situation to others without knowing the true details behind those appearances. The problem with envy is that it rarely targets people who are already failing. Envy attacks people who are actually succeeding until they looked sideways and began measuring themselves against someone else's timeline. The neighbor with the expensive car might be financing it at an interest rate that will trap them in debt for years. The colleague with the larger house might be one unexpected job loss away from financial disaster. The friend who appears to be getting rich quickly might be taking risks that will eventually wipe them out. You rarely know the full story, but envy doesn't care about the full story. Envy only sees the surface, and the surface is often carefully designed to deceive. There will always be someone getting richer faster than you. That fact is not a tragedy. The tragedy occurs when you allow that observation to derail your own steady progress toward the threshold that changes everything. And if envy continues unchecked, it leads directly to the next psychological trap that prevents people from building wealth in the first place. Self-pity. Self-pity is one of the most destructive mental habits a person can develop, and in the world of money, it is especially dangerous. Once someone begins feeling sorry for themselves, progress almost always stops. Instead of focusing on solutions, they begin focusing on excuses. They start thinking about how the system is unfair, how other people had advantages they didn't have, or how the timing in their life was simply unlucky. Whether those things are true or not doesn't really matter, because self-pity never improves a financial situation. It only makes a difficult situation worse by draining the energy required to change it. Self-pity also has a close relationship with another dangerous mindset, paranoia. When people stay in self-pity long enough, they start believing the entire world is working against them. They assume every opportunity is a trap, every success story is fake, and every wealthy person must have cheated the system. Once someone reaches that mental state, they stop taking action entirely. And when you stop acting, the result is predictable. Nothing improves. The moment you notice yourself drifting into self-pity, the best strategy is to interrupt it immediately. Your starting point might be difficult. Your circumstances might not be ideal. But feeling sorry for yourself will never solve those problems. It only makes you weaker at the exact moment when you need strength. There is a mental technique that can help avoid this trap, and it's surprisingly powerful. It's called inversion. Instead of asking what you need to do to become wealthy, you ask a different question. What guarantees that someone stays poor forever? This approach may sound simple, but it produces incredibly clear answers. When you list the behaviors that guarantee financial failure, the strategy for avoiding failure becomes obvious. Spending more money than you earn guarantees financial failure. Refusing to save anything guarantees financial failure. Taking on high-interest debt guarantees financial failure. Being unreliable at work guarantees that nobody will promote you or trust you with responsibility. Acting on envy leads people to take reckless risks. Feeling sorry for yourself keeps you passive when you need to be active. Once you recognize these patterns, the strategy becomes remarkably straightforward. Avoid the behaviors that guarantee failure. This is not about being brilliant, it's about being consistently not stupid. One of the greatest advantages in life often comes not from extraordinary intelligence, but from avoiding obvious mistakes over long periods of time. Many people try very hard to appear smart. In reality, long-term success often comes from something simpler, refusing to do foolish things repeatedly. One principle captures this idea perfectly, yet it is ignored by an astonishing number of people. Spend less than you earn. Always save something. Over time, those savings will accumulate. This concept is so obvious that people often dismiss it as trivial, but the simplicity hides its power. Spending less than you earn, investing wisely, avoiding toxic people and destructive habits, continuing to learn throughout your life, and practicing delayed gratification create an almost certain path toward reaching that first $15,000 milestone. And if you refuse to follow those principles, then your financial future will depend largely on luck. Luck is not a reliable strategy. Let me tell you what happened after my failure in 1982. Borrowing $4,000 from my father was not just financially painful, it was psychologically humbling. I realized that I couldn't simply rebuild my investment business the same way I had built it before. I had to rebuild my entire approach. So I went back to basics. I carefully studied every mistake I had made. I wrote down each principle I had violated. Then I created a system designed to prevent those mistakes from happening again. Within 2 years, I had repaid my father completely. Within 5 years, Bridgewater Associates had grown to manage $5 million. Today, the firm manages over $120 billion. People sometimes assume that growth happened because I became dramatically smarter. The reality is much simpler. It happened because I built a system and followed it consistently. The exact same principle applies to personal wealth. Reaching $15,000 is not about motivation or occasional bursts of discipline. Motivation fades. Willpower fluctuates. What you need instead is a system. A system means that saving happens automatically the moment you get paid. A system means you track your spending so every dollar has a purpose. A system means you gradually increase your income through additional skills or side work. A system means you reduce wasteful spending and repeat the process every month. You follow the system regardless of how you feel. Now there is another topic that deserves careful attention because it destroys many intelligent people right before they reach the threshold that changes everything. That topic is leverage. Leverage simply means borrowing money to invest. In theory, it can accelerate gains. In practice, it often accelerates disaster. There are 3 classic ways for intelligent people to ruin themselves financially: liquor, ladies, and leverage. Of those 3, leverage has historically caused the most damage. The pattern repeats over and over again. Someone begins saving and gradually accumulates $8,000 or $10,000. They are close to crossing the $15,000 threshold, but progress feels slow. Impatience begins to grow. Then someone introduces the idea of borrowing money to invest. At first it looks brilliant. Because leverage magnifies gains, the early results may appear spectacular. For a short period of time, everything works beautifully. Then the market moves in the opposite direction. Suddenly, leverage magnifies losses instead of gains. The person who borrowed money now owes more than they can repay. The entire savings they spent years accumulating disappears almost overnight. At Bridgewater, we have always been extremely cautious with leverage. That caution is not based on fear, it is based on arithmetic. Getting rich only needs to happen once. If you build wealth slowly without leverage, nobody can suddenly take it away from you. But if you rely on borrowed money to accelerate the process, you expose yourself to the risk of losing everything just before you reach the point where the math finally begins working in your favor. The beauty of building wealth patiently is that you only have to succeed one time. And once you finally cross that $15,000 threshold, something remarkable begins to happen. But before that transformation occurs, there is another factor that must enter the equation: your earning power. Earning power is the other half of the equation that people often overlook when thinking about building wealth. Saving money matters enormously, but saving alone cannot carry the entire process forever. At some point, the ability to earn more becomes just as important as the discipline to keep part of what you earn. There is a simple principle behind this idea. The safest way to get what you want in life is to try to deserve it. Increasing your income almost always comes down to becoming more valuable to the world around you. That means developing skills that other people are willing to pay for. It means becoming reliable, knowledgeable, and capable enough that opportunities begin moving toward you instead of away from you. And this process does not happen once. It continues throughout your entire life. The people who steadily rise in wealth over time are not always the most naturally intelligent individuals in the room. Often they are something else entirely. Learning machines. They go to bed each night knowing slightly more than they knew when they woke up that morning. Over years and decades, that habit compounds just like money does. This idea may sound simple, but it has powerful implications. Wisdom acquisition is not optional if you want to succeed financially. It is a moral duty to yourself. Lifelong learning is mandatory. Without it, your earning power eventually stagnates. If you study successful individuals across industries, you will notice a common trait: they read constantly, they study constantly. They are curious about how systems work, how markets move, how people behave, and how problems get solved. I have never met a truly wise person who did not read regularly. Not one, none. If you are sitting there today with a modest salary and you feel stuck, remember something important. Your income today is not necessarily your income forever, but it can become your income forever if you stop learning. When learning stops, growth stops. On the other hand, when you continue developing your abilities, your earning power begins increasing over time. As your earning power increases, your ability to save increases. And as your savings grow, the power of compounding begins to accelerate the entire process. Let me give you a personal example from early in my career that illustrates this point very clearly. At one stage, a friend and I entered into a real estate partnership together. Each of us contributed $15,000. At that time, that amount represented every dollar I had saved. It was the result of years of careful discipline and sacrifice. Together we purchased a small apartment building. It wasn't glamorous. It required renovation work and management effort. But we saw an opportunity to improve the property and increase its value. Over the next 3 years, we renovated the building, improved the units, and gradually raised the rents. Eventually, we sold the property. My original $15,000 investment turned into $47,000. That was my first real experience seeing what capital can do when it is deployed intelligently. But there is an important detail that people often miss when hearing stories like this. I could not have participated in that opportunity with $5,000. The deal required a minimum investment of $15,000. If I had still been below that threshold, I would have simply watched the opportunity pass by. Crossing that threshold made participation possible, and that illustrates a critical principle about money. Opportunities become visible once you have capital. People often complain that wealthy individuals have access to better opportunities. In many cases that is true, but not necessarily because the system is unfair. It is because capital itself attracts opportunity. When you have money available, doors begin opening that remain invisible to people who have none. Capital allows you to participate in investments, partnerships, and business ideas that are simply unavailable to someone living paycheck to paycheck. And when those opportunities produce returns, they generate even more capital. This creates what economists call a virtuous cycle. Capital leads to opportunity. Opportunity produces more capital. More capital creates even greater opportunity.